There's a moment every mother dreads. The moment she realizes the child she raised is no longer the person she believed in. Imagine flying across the country because something inside you whispers that something is terribly wrong, only to discover your daughter-in-law is fighting for her life alone in a cold ICU room, while your son, the boy you once rocked to sleep, is out laughing, partying, and speeding around town with other women. What do you do in that moment? Do you cry? Do you break? Or does something inside you harden into steel? This is the story of a mother who decided love didn't mean blind devotion anymore. A mother who chose justice over blood. A mother who refused to let cruelty win, even if it meant destroying the son she once would have died for. And trust me, what she does next changes everything. There are mothers who panic easily over every small thing. And then there are mothers who learn, through years of life and responsibility, when unease isn't just worry, but a warning. She belonged to the second kind. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't impulsive. She was the kind of woman who planned holidays weeks ahead, who kept receipts in labeled folders, who kept calm even when life threw storms. But for 3 days, her phone had rung and rung with no answer. And that silence didn't feel like oversight. It felt like danger. Every unanswered call layered another weight on her chest. Her daughter-in-law, usually warm, gentle, and grateful for every small kindness, had stopped replying too. And silence from someone kind rarely meant indifference. It meant suffering. So she did the one thing she never imagined herself doing. She dropped everything, booked the soonest ticket she could find, and flew across the country with nothing but a purse, a few clothes, and a gnawing certainty that something terrible was waiting for her on the other side. The airport should have greeted her with joy like it always did when she came to visit. Instead, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Her steps felt heavier than her luggage. She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that maybe they were busy. Maybe they were just working through a rough patch. Maybe life wasn't falling apart. But anxiety doesn't lie, not when it's born from love. The ride from the airport to their apartment felt endless. Every traffic light stretched time. Every mile fed her dread. And when she finally stepped into the building she'd proudly gifted them, the one she'd chosen believing it would be the foundation of their happy future, something inside her cracked. The hallway smelled neglected. The door wasn't fully shut. It hung slightly ajar, as if whoever last left didn't care enough to secure the home. Inside, the stale air carried everything she didn't want to believe. Decay, carelessness, and neglect. Boots scattered, clothes tossed, bottles left where they fell. There was no warmth, no sign of love, no trace of a functioning home. Just evidence of recklessness. And more terrifying than the mess was the loneliness. No one had been living here. They had simply existed. And not very well. But pain deepened when she found the real truth. There on the kitchen table, unpaid medical bills, ignored prescriptions, dust-covered medication, meant for the woman who should have been cherished. And beside them, neighbors' words cut sharper than any blade. Her daughter-in-law had been taken by ambulance. Days ago, no husband by her side, no comforting hand, just strangers and flashing lights escorting a fragile woman toward life or death. While her husband, the boy she raised, the child she protected from every bruise and heartbreak, vanished into nightlife and ego instead of responsibility. Fear turned into fury and heartbreak all at once. What kind of man abandons the woman he vowed to love? What kind of son ignores his mother's voice and vanishes from his own life? Questions burned through her, but answers no longer mattered. She didn't have the luxury of shock. She only had one priority: get to the hospital, no matter what it took. Because if there was one thing she still had left to give, it was strength. The hospital smelled like sterility and sorrow, the kind of place where prayers cling to ceilings and loved ones sit, clutching hope like fragile glass. And when she reached the ICU and saw the pale, fragile woman lying there, cold, thin, breathing only because machines refused to give up, she felt something inside her freeze. Her daughter-in-law wasn't just sick. She had been abandoned, starved, ignored, left to crash slowly into death while the one person who swore to protect her chose parties, attention, and lies instead. No mother prepares for the moment she realizes her child is capable of cruelty. No mother prepares for the moment she sees evidence that the boy she raised is not a boy lost, but a man who chose selfishness over humanity. Standing there surrounded by hospital walls and every heartbeat counted by machines. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She made a silent promise instead. A vow. If her son couldn't be the man he should have been, then she would become what the situation demanded: protector, guardian, judge, and if necessary, executioner of his illusions. Because sometimes a mother's instinct isn't just to comfort, it is to fight. And this time, she was ready to fight harder than she ever had in her life. There are places that speak even when no one is inside. When she returned to that apartment after the hospital, she didn't step into a home. She stepped into a confession, the kind made not with words, but with neglect. It was silent, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that screams in its own way. Bottles on the table weren't just signs of carelessness. They were evidence of repeated nights where responsibility wasn't even a thought. Unopened letters and overdue notices weren't just paperwork. They were proof of someone who stopped caring long ago. And everywhere she looked, there was one message repeating over and over again. This wasn't just laziness. It was abandonment. Not of the apartment, not of the money, but of the life that should have been cherished inside these walls. It hurt more than anger. It hurt like betrayal. She moved slowly, as if walking through a memory that didn't want to break. Her hand brushed across the kitchen counter, once meant to hold shared meals and laughter. Now it hosted dust, spills, and fast food remnants that spoke of nights spent anywhere but here, emotionally. In the living room, curtains were still open, but light refused to feel warm. It bounced off empty liquor bottles, glossed over cracked picture frames where forced smiles looked like distant ghosts. She paused at one particular picture, her son, arm around his wife, smiling brightly. The smile she once believed meant happiness now looked like arrogance. It was the same smile she had spoiled for years, the same charm she used to defend, justify, excuse. Maybe she hadn't raised a monster. Maybe she had protected one long enough for him to grow comfortable being cruel. That realization cut deeper than anything else. This wasn't just about him failing as a husband. This was about motherhood, loving so blindly. It gave him the permission to never grow. Then she found it. The detail that didn't fit the chaos. Neatly stacked laundry, but only his. Jackets, expensive shoes lined up with care, cologne bottles perfectly arranged, his world kept pristine. Her daughter-in-law's things, however, were shoved aside carelessly, like inconveniences, rather than belongings of a woman who lived here too. Her heart twisted painfully. This home wasn't shared. It was ruled. And she could suddenly see the emotional blueprint of their marriage laid bare in these walls. His things mattered. His comfort mattered. His image mattered. She didn't. Love wasn't missing from this home. Respect was. And when respect disappears, love becomes a weapon. Slowly, the mother began piecing together the silent truth. This wasn't sudden neglect. This had been happening gradually, painfully, quietly. And all the while her daughter-in-law endured it alone. Because sometimes victims don't scream. They survive in quiet heartbreak until they simply collapse. She stood in the center of the living room and let the weight of everything sink into her bones. This wasn't the future she worked her whole life to give her child. This wasn't the life she imagined when she signed the deed, when she handed over the keys with pride, when she smiled and said, "This is your beginning." Instead, it was the wreckage of entitlement, the destruction born when someone believes they can simply take without ever giving. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel guilt for the anger rising inside her. She didn't feel guilt for the disappointment flooding her chest. She didn't feel guilt for the instinct whispering that all of this, needed to end. The apartment wasn't just a mess, it was a mirror, reflecting the truth she could no longer ignore. Her son had built a kingdom of selfishness, and the cost wasn't just the house. It was a life, a woman, a marriage, maybe even his own humanity. And standing there, amid the ruins of entitlement, she made another silent promise. This home would never feel like this again. Not while she still had strength left in her. Hospitals have a way of humbling people. No matter how loud life outside is, inside those walls, everything feels quieter, heavier, slower. As if time itself is afraid to move too fast. When she walked back into the ICU after seeing the apartment, she didn't just see a patient anymore. She saw the full truth. Her daughter-in-law didn't land here because of bad luck or sudden illness. She was here because someone failed her, someone who promised to love her, someone who was supposed to protect her. Beneath the tubes, the flashing monitor lights, and the soft hiss of machines forcing breath into fragile lungs, there was a woman who had been left to fight alone. The doctor's words only made the pain sharper. Severe pneumonia, dehydration, exhaustion. Not days of decline. Weeks. Weeks of suffering. Weeks of weakness. Weeks where someone noticed and chose to look away. She sat beside the bed and took the younger woman's hand, stunned at how light it felt. Like holding paper. This wasn't how wives should look. This wasn't how someone in a happy marriage should end up. Sickness happens, yes, but neglect? That's deliberate cruelty wearing the mask of inconvenience. And it burned in the mother's chest that somewhere out there, her son, the child she once held feverish in her arms, the boy she rushed to doctors without hesitation, the life she dedicated everything to, was living freely, laughing freely, enjoying life freely, while the woman who trusted him lay here collecting bruises from IV needles instead of kisses from a husband. If there's one thing the universe rarely forgives, it's indifference. And sitting there listening to beeping monitors, she realized something crueler than death had already happened. This girl had been dying long before her body collapsed. But somewhere in the cold, sterile quiet, a spark of tenderness remained. She leaned forward and spoke softly, even though the doctors had warned she might not respond. She talked anyway. Because sometimes words are medicine too. She talked about warm kitchens, about laughter, about better days coming. She talked like family does, with comfort, with steadiness, with promise. And maybe the unconscious hear more than we know, because tears pooled at the corner of the young woman's eyes. That broke her completely. Tears of someone who couldn't speak, someone who had been unheard for so long, someone who maybe thought no one would ever come for her. finally falling because someone finally stayed. In that second, something shifted inside the mother. She stopped seeing her as daughter-in-law. She saw a girl who had been loved too little, controlled too much, and abandoned long before this hospital room. She saw someone who deserved protecting, even if it meant standing against the blood she gave birth to. And that's when the quiet fury hardened into resolve. There are moments in life that rewrite who you are. Moments that take you from gentle to unbreakable, from forgiving to fearless. This was one of those moments. She realized this wasn't just a medical fight. It was a moral one. And if fate had placed this fragile young woman's life in her hands, then she wasn't going to hold back. Not anymore. Not ever again. Whether her son liked it or not, whether the world judged her for it or not, she would become the shield this girl never had. She would not let her be alone another second. She would not let her suffer unseen again, and most importantly, she would make sure the man responsible finally faced a truth he had escaped all his life. Actions have consequences, even for sons, especially for sons. There are lies people tell to protect themselves. And then there are lies so bold, so cold. They don't just hurt. They shatter something permanent inside you. She learned about that kind of lie the evening she walked out of the hospital, to breathe for a moment, to clear her head, to gather strength before returning to the bedside. The city lights glowed softly, cars passed, life continued like nothing was wrong. But her life wasn't steady anymore. It was a fault line waiting to break. And then it happened. Tires screeched, bass thundered, laughter exploded into the night from a midnight blue SUV she knew all too well, because she bought it. For family, for responsibility, for safety. Her son's head was thrown back in laughter. Two women leaned out the windows like their life was a party. There was no grief in him, no worry, no weight, just vanity and thrill. He didn't even glance toward the building where his wife was fighting death. She didn't even have time to process the betrayal fully, because at that exact second, her phone buzzed with a message from him. "Mama, pray for us. I'm at the hospital. I haven't left her side." The world didn't spin. It just stopped. There's heartbreak. And then there's the moment respect dies. Respect is what keeps love dignified. And when it's gone, love doesn't soften pain. It amplifies it. She stared at the glowing screen, the fake sorrow, the drama, the fake bravery, the "pray for us" plea, typed by the same hands gripping a steering wheel as he blasted music past the ICU, where his wife's life hung on machines. It wasn't immaturity anymore. It wasn't bad judgment. It wasn't, "He's just lost." This was deliberate. This was manipulation. This was a man who saw suffering and chose to fabricate a noble version of himself instead of facing truth. And suddenly, all the years flashed back. The excuses she'd made for him, the chances she'd handed out like candy, the way she'd protected him from consequences, thinking she was being a good mother. She wasn't protecting him. She was feeding this monster he'd learned to be. And for the first time, she hated what she'd helped create. She didn't scream. She didn't melt. She didn't spiral. Something colder and far more dangerous settled inside her. There is a very specific silence inside a mother when love stops blinding her. It's not calm. It's clarity. Sharp, crystal, terrifying clarity. She walked back inside the hospital with steady steps. The lobby hummed quietly. Machines beeped softly behind closed ICU doors. But inside her, a storm reorganized itself into strategy. She didn't owe him softness anymore. She didn't owe him blind defense. She didn't owe him the protection he had weaponized. Instead, she owed the fragile girl fighting for every breath. She owed truth. She owed justice. and she owed herself the strength she forgot she had. So she made a vow stronger than any promise she'd made before. If her son chose to abandon his humanity, then she would no longer carry it for him. From this moment on, she would fight for the innocent, not for the one causing the pain. The text stayed on her phone, glowing like a final insult, and she let that anger harden, not into rage, but into purpose. Because tears wouldn't help that girl breathe. Begging wouldn't make him change. Pleading wouldn't fix what years of indulgence broke. Real strength sometimes arrives the moment love learns to stop enabling. And that night, under fluorescent hospital lights and a heart monitor ticking like fate itself, a mother transformed. A line was drawn that could never be erased. There would be no more illusions, no more shielding, no more pretending he was still just a kid. He was a grown man making cruel choices, and she was now a mother who would hold him accountable, no matter how much it hurt. He just didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn in the most devastating way that the woman who once protected him was about to become the storm he could not outrun. There are moments in life when emotions stop being a weakness and become fuel. That night, after seeing the lie her son so confidently lived, she didn't collapse into grief the way people expected a mother to. She didn't curl up somewhere crying over where she went wrong. Instead, she sat quietly in a plastic hospital chair, hands clasped together, and began thinking. Really thinking. For the first time without love, clouding her vision. All the pieces were already there. The ignored calls, the abandoned apartment, the starving silence of a marriage falling apart, the hospital room where life clung desperately to machinery. And then that car, loud, confident, arrogant, cutting through the night like proof he believed he was untouchable. Maybe once that would have broken her. Maybe once love would have begged her to forgive and understand. But something stronger than love rose now. Responsibility. Not the responsibility of being his mother, but the responsibility of being a protector to someone truly innocent. The first step didn't come from rage. It came from precision. She knew her son too well. He thrived on privilege, access, and comfort. Every reckless decision was cushioned by the knowledge that Mama will fix it. So she decided to take away the cushion, one by one, piece by piece, not out of revenge, but because letting him keep power meant letting him keep hurting others. When she picked up the phone to report the very car she bought for him as stolen, her voice didn't shake. The car was in her name, the insurance under her file, the control legally hers. And if there was one thing she understood about consequences, it was that they must be undeniable. No more warnings, no more lectures that he'd laugh off. She wanted something undeniable to stand in front of him. Flashing police lights, reality slamming the brakes on his fantasy. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't just caught. He was cornered, held accountable. And oddly, the moment she hung up, she didn't feel guilt. She felt relief, like choosing truth finally let her breathe. But accountability couldn't stop with sirens. Not when the real battlefield was much deeper than traffic stops and police reports. His irresponsibility didn't just hurt himself. It left someone else fighting for life. So she called a lawyer next. Not impulsively, not dramatically, calmly, strategically. The apartment? He didn't deserve control. He had turned what should have been a safe home into a battlefield of ego, neglect, and cruelty. That wasn't a privilege he'd get to keep. Paperwork began moving faster than guilt could catch up. Power shifted legally, carefully, permanently. Bit by bit, she wasn't just cleaning up chaos. She was dismantling the fantasy world he lived in. The one where he always wins, always escapes, always gets forgiven. And as she signed documents, arranged protection, and secured care for the young woman fighting in that ICU bed, something extraordinary happened. She didn't feel weak anymore. She didn't feel trapped in motherly duty. She felt powerful, like a woman finally stepping into the strength she had always possessed, but rarely used for herself. Through all of it, she never once lost sight of who she was doing this for. Not for revenge, not to punish blindly, but to save someone who had never had real protection, to prove that love, real love, is not measured by how much pain you tolerate, but by how fiercely you stop pain when you see it. By the time the sun rose, the world outside looked the same, but she wasn't. She was softer at the bedside, kinder in the ICU, steady where fear might have lived, but sharper when it came to him. Steel, unbendable, unintimidated, unapologetic. She didn't know how he'd react yet, whether he'd come with anger, tears, manipulation, or blame. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Whatever version of him showed up, she was ready, because love had stopped blinding her. It now fueled her strength. And there is nothing on earth more unstoppable than a mother who finally decides, enough. By the next morning, the hospital didn't just feel like a building anymore. It felt like a battlefield she refused to surrender. She walked the hallways not as a worried visitor, but as a guardian staking a claim. The doctors briefed her again. There was improvement, but it was fragile. Recovery wasn't guaranteed. One setback could unravel everything. Hearing that, something in her steadiness deepened. Fear didn't make her weaker. It sharpened her resolve. She wasn't going to simply sit and hope anymore. Hope was too passive. Action was safer. So she became present in every detail, speaking with nurses, signing upgraded care forms, arranging private assistance, making sure not 1 second of this girl's treatment lacked attention or resources. People around her saw an elegant, composed woman, but they had no idea they were standing next to a storm disguised as calm. Because while emotion could crumble anyone, purpose kept her upright. It didn't take long before the staff began seeing her not as the mother-in-law, but as the anchor. She was there when medical charts were updated. She was there when medication schedules were explained. She was there when outcomes were cautious, when progress was slow, when setbacks loomed like shadows, and when her daughter-in-law stirred slightly, the faintest twitch of fingers, the smallest sign of life. The mother didn't break down sobbing. She leaned forward and whispered gently, steady as ever. "You're safe. You're not alone anymore." Those words weren't dramatic. They weren't desperate. They were rooted. They were a promise spoken from the kind of strength that grows after heartbreak burns away illusion. In those moments, she understood something profound. This girl hadn't just needed medical help. She had needed someone to choose her, truly choose her. Without conditions, without obligation, without fear. For the first time in a long time, this young woman was being cared for, not because it was expected, but because she deserved it. And then came the discovery that turned determination into absolute fire. While retrieving personal identification for hospital processing, she found the diary. Quiet handwriting, hidden pain, recorded loneliness no one bothered to hear. Page after page revealed a life of emotional erosion, financial manipulation, humiliation masked as jokes, loneliness disguised as marriage, a slow draining of confidence until silence felt safer than speaking. Reading it wasn't like being hit. It was like drowning in truth she wished wasn't real. This girl hadn't simply fallen ill. She'd been neglected into collapse. And suddenly, any lingering hesitation evaporated. This wasn't about disciplining a wayward son anymore. It was about confronting someone who had crossed from irresponsible into cruel. The kind of cruelty that hides behind charm and excuses, leaving no bruises but leaving scars deeper than bone. A different kind of anger filled her then. One that wasn't loud but frighteningly clear. This girl would never go through that again. Not if she had breath left in her body. So she fortified everything. Legal protection, security precautions, boundaries that could not be stepped over. She wasn't naive. She knew her son wouldn't surrender quietly. Men who thrive on control rarely do. There would be tears, apologies, rage, excuses, threats. The full theater of a guilty man afraid of consequences. But she also knew something more important. He had finally underestimated the wrong woman. She wasn't weak, loving mother anymore. She was strength wrapped in tenderness and iron wrapped in compassion. And while machines hummed softly in the hospital room, while doctors worked, while the world continued spinning, she stood there, steady, unyielding, fiercely protective, ready to shield, to fight, to rebuild. For once, her love wasn't directed toward the child who abused it. It was directed toward the innocent who needed it. And that shift, that powerful redirection of devotion, wasn't just an act of courage. It was an act of justice. Because sometimes the greatest kindness a mother can offer the world is refusing to let cruelty continue, even if it means standing against her own blood. There are confrontations you rehearse in your head, arguments you imagine, words you prepare. And then there are moments that ambush you before you're ready. When her son finally walked into the hospital lobby, reality collided with fantasy all at once. He didn't arrive like a broken husband or a grieving partner. He came in loud, demanding, self-righteous. Exactly the boy who thought the world still bent around him. His clothes were wrinkled from his brief time in custody, his ego bruised but not humbled. Anger burned where remorse should have been. He marched toward her, expecting submission, expecting his mother to apologize, to soothe, to rescue him like she always had. Instead, he found a woman sitting calmly, spine straight, eyes steady, heart armored with everything she had seen and learned. That calmness rattled him more than any screaming ever could. He shouted, accused, blamed, declaring it a misunderstanding, insisting she went too far, threatening to sue her, manipulate her, guilt-trip her. He was throwing every emotional weapon he'd ever used successfully. But for the first time in his life, none of them landed. She didn't rise. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She waited until he ran out of theatrics and finally stood there breathing hard, waiting for her to crumble. Only then did she speak, not like a trembling mother, not like a frightened parent trying to maintain peace, but like a judge delivering truth. She told him about the hospital room, the dehydration, the medical neglect, the diary, the reality that his wife didn't just get sick. She was abandoned into illness. And when she described the night she watched him speed by laughing, when she mentioned his fabricated text about being by his wife's side, something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, not shame, exposure. For the first time he realized he wasn't up against a soft heart anymore. He was up against facts, against a woman who finally saw him clearly. He tried to pivot then, tried to cry, tried to collapse into dramatics, tried to paint himself as lost, as misunderstood, as desperate. But she'd read the diary. She'd seen the apartment. She'd held a dying girl's hand. There was no spell he could cast anymore. Still, she let him speak. She let him twist and spin and perform the heartbreak he'd never truly felt. When he dropped to his knees, when he clung to her coat like a frightened child, when he cried, "Mama, please." She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt sorrow. For the years she had enabled this version of him. But sorrow no longer translated into surrender. She spoke steadily, not to hurt him, but because truth was overdue. She told him she loved him, yes. But loving someone didn't mean allowing them to destroy another person's life. She told him love without accountability turns into poison. She told him she would not carry the weight of his consequences anymore. Watching the truth land on him was like watching a spoiled kingdom crumble. He wasn't crying for his wife. He wasn't crying for what he'd done. He was crying because his world, the world where he was always forgiven, always rescued, always protected, was finally ending. And when he finally choked out the desperate plea, asking for money, demanding access, begging for help against the trouble he'd put himself into. That was the final line. Not the tears, not the shouting, but the fact that even now, even after the destruction, his instinct wasn't concern, wasn't guilt, wasn't love. It was self-preservation. That was when she understood completely. Letting him suffer wasn't cruelty. Shielding him was. So she stood, looked down at the child she raised into a man who never learned consequences, and chose strength over fear. She told him no, not cruelly, not dramatically, simply, firmly. No. He called her heartless, he cursed, he threatened, he screamed. And security eventually escorted him out, his fury echoing through the hospital hallway. She didn't collapse afterward. She didn't shake. She didn't doubt. She just stood there for a moment, breathing in the sterile air, feeling something extraordinary. Peace. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't protecting his comfort. She was protecting what was right. And that, she realized, was the hardest and the bravest thing she had ever done as a mother. There is a difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment is fueled by anger. Consequence is born from justice. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was truth, finally catching up to the life he'd been coasting through, unchecked. The world he once strutted through with arrogance began shrinking around him in ways he never expected. The apartment he'd bragged about, the symbol of his success, no longer carried his name. Locks changed, papers filed, access denied. The car he loved more than responsibility, the car he used to parade his ego, was gone, sold, turned into life support for the woman he left behind. For the first time in his adult life, he stood in front of doors that wouldn't open simply because he demanded they should. He was discovering something many people learn early, but he had always been shielded from. Entitlement collapses the moment reality stops indulging it, and reality was done indulging him. At first, he reacted the only way someone like him knew how, with fury. Rage is easy when life has always bent to your will. He stormed, he yelled, he played the victim to anyone who would listen. Friends who once smiled at him in bars and rode in his car with envy began stepping back. People who tolerated him when he was useful suddenly had no reason to stay. His social world shrank into silence. Pride has a loud voice when it thinks it has power. It turns quieter when no one is listening. Then came the desperation phase. The calls, the messages, the half apologies stitched together with blame. He tried to twist the narrative. He was misunderstood. He was overwhelmed. He was going through things. But excuses crumble fast when truth stands right in front of them. No one believed the hero story he tried to craft anymore, not when his actions were laid bare. The part that hurt him most wasn't that people judged him. It was that people finally saw him. And while his world unraveled, hers didn't shatter. It steadied. She didn't rejoice in his struggle. There was no celebration in watching her own child stumble. It hurt. Of course it hurt. There were moments when old instincts tried creeping back in. Moments when a mother's heart trembled at the sound of his name. When memory pulled forward images of a little boy with scraped knees instead of the grown man who chose cruelty. But every time softness tried to weaken her resolve, she remembered the hospital bed, the trembling hands, the tear slipping down from a woman too weak to speak. She remembered the diary, the fear, the loneliness. She remembered every silent cry ignored, and she remembered the lie, the most unforgivable one, the lie he told without hesitation while his wife lay dying alone. That memory anchored her, not in bitterness, in clarity. Standing strong wasn't heartlessness, it was protection. And sometimes love looks like distance when closeness only enables damage. Life has a way of balancing itself, slowly but thoroughly. While his days turned into lessons he should have learned years ago, the hospital room began changing too. Beeps turned steady. Fragile breaths turned stronger. Light returned to weary eyes. A girl once abandoned began to wake into a world where, for once, someone actually stayed. And in that healing she, the mother, found a strange, bitter-sweet peace. She hadn't chosen this war, but she fought it because someone needed to. And as she watched the weak recover and the selfish crumble, she understood something deeply human. Power doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from protecting what is right, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. And her son, stripped of his illusions, facing consequences for the first time in his life, was finally standing in the very place life had tried to warn him about for years, alone with his choices, face to face with the truth. And the story wasn't finished yet, because consequence wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning of who each of them would become next. Healing never arrives like thunder. It creeps in quietly, gently, almost shyly. And that is exactly how the change began. Weeks slipped into months, and slowly the hospital became less of a battlefield and more of a doorway back to life. There came a day when the machines finally stepped back, when breath no longer needed to be encouraged by wires, when eyes stayed open without fading. She was there for every milestone. She was there the first time the younger woman whispered a word, the first time she ate a real meal, the first time color returned to her face. The doctors called it steady improvement. Nurses called it a miracle with good care. But to the mother, it felt like redemption, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that proves it didn't win. The first time her daughter-in-law smiled, really smiled. It wasn't bright or loud. It was soft, grateful, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. In that quiet smile, the mother felt something warm unfold inside her. Hope that didn't hurt anymore. Life after the hospital didn't feel like the past. It felt new, fragile, and full of deliberate choices. The apartment that had once echoed with neglect slowly transformed into a sanctuary. Walls were freshened, curtains changed, furniture rearranged, not to erase memory, but to reclaim space. There was laughter in that home now, not loud at first, but sincere. Warm meals simmered again. Music played softly instead of shaking windows. It became a place where peace didn't feel like a stranger anymore. And through it all, the younger woman, once helpless in bed, began living rather than merely surviving. She talked more. She laughed more. She began making choices for herself. She learned how to say no without trembling. She learned that love doesn't mean shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. And slowly, She began believing it. Watching her grow wasn't just beautiful. It was heartbreaking in its own way, because it made it clear how much strength she had always carried beneath all that silence. As her daughter-in-law rebuilt herself, the mother rebuilt too. She had spent so many years being strong in the wrong direction, shielding the wrong person, carrying the wrong weight. Now, her strength finally had purpose. Their bond wasn't built out of obligation or shared pain anymore. It was built out of mutual respect, gratitude, and a tenderness neither expected but both deeply needed. The younger woman didn't call her mother-in-law anymore. She called her something softer, warmer, something that sounded like family without fear. And for the mother, every small moment, tea shared in the evening, quiet conversations at the kitchen table, gentle laughter in the middle of ordinary afternoons, became proof that she had chosen right. She hadn't destroyed her son's life out of hatred. She had saved a woman's life out of love. That love had grown into something profoundly human, something sacred. But even peace carries shadows. There were nights when the mother sat by the balcony or the window and wondered if there had been another way, wondered if things could have gone differently, wondered if motherhood and justice were ever meant to coexist without pain. Because rebuilding doesn't erase history. It simply allows life to exist beyond it. She knew her son was out there somewhere, tasting the consequences of a lifetime of choices he never thought would return to him. Part of her still hurt at the thought. Part of her wished he had learned before it came to this. Yet every time doubt tried to guilt her, she thought of those machines in the hospital, those tears of fear, that diary full of suffering. And the doubt quieted. Peace didn't come from pretending everything was okay. Peace came from protecting what deserved to live. Life was moving forward again, gently but firmly. And though she didn't know exactly what the future held, she knew this much. Both she and the woman she saved were no longer victims of his world. They were survivors who chose something better, and they were finally living it. Some endings don't come with explosions or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. The day she saw him again wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. There were no speeches rehearsed in advance. She was simply out, living life the way she had fought so hard to protect her. Running errands, breathing easier than she had in months, carrying a small list of groceries, and the calm comfort of knowing the woman she had saved was home, warm, safe, smiling. The street was busy enough that she almost missed him entirely. Almost. But instinct, that instinct that had once warned her something was terribly wrong, recognized him before her eyes fully did. He stood across the street, thinner, worn, stripped of the careless confidence that once wrapped around him like armor. His clothes were ordinary. His posture wasn't proud. His eyes didn't blaze with arrogance. They looked tired, older, human in a way she had never seen before. For a moment, time stretched between them like a fragile bridge neither of them dared to step onto. He saw her, too, and whatever pride he once owned vanished in a quiet exhale. There was no grand entrance, no shouting, none of the manipulation she once knew too well. Just a man staring at the mother who had taught him everything, and taken away everything when he refused to learn. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, like someone approaching the edge of a cliff he wasn't sure he deserved to cross. When he finally stopped in front of her, there were no theatrics, only a raw, stripped-down silence that said more than his words ever had. "Ma," he whispered. The word didn't burst out the way it once did, full of entitlement and expectation. It came out fragile, unsure. like a child knocking on a door he no longer believed he had the right to enter. For a heartbeat, the world didn't exist. Just the sound of traffic, the faint breeze, and two lives standing at the crossroads of what used to be family. He tried to speak, but words faltered. Not excuses this time, not lies, just broken pieces of truth that didn't know how to shape themselves into full sentences. He admitted it, not with pride, not with drama, but with a quiet acknowledgement that sounded achingly real. He confessed not because he wanted to return to the life he'd lost, but because, for the first time, he finally understood the life he'd thrown away. He didn't beg for money. He didn't ask for the apartment back. He didn't demand forgiveness like a right. He simply asked for something smaller, something painfully honest. A chance to be seen as someone trying, not someone entitled. A chance to be acknowledged as a man who finally felt the weight of everything he'd done. A chance, maybe, not to be loved the same way, but to not be completely erased from her world. And that was the moment the true battle began. Not between mother and son, but inside her own heart. Because strength isn't just standing firm when you walk away. Sometimes, strength is standing still long enough to feel the ache without letting it dictate you. She listened. She didn't crumble. She didn't lash out. She didn't wrap him in forgiveness like nothing happened. She stood in the full truth of everything they'd lived. She remembered the hospital, the lies, the diary, the tears. She remembered the girl she protected and still protects. She remembered who he chose to be, and who she chose to become in response. And then, with that clarity, she made the final choice. Not driven by guilt, not driven by anger, not driven by obligation, but by balance. She did not invite him back into her life. She did not reopen the doors she had closed to keep someone safe. But she didn't destroy him either. She told him gently but firmly that forgiveness was not a gateway. It was a boundary. She forgave him enough to let go of hatred, but not enough to let him endanger anyone again. She wished him well. She told him to heal, to grow, to prove to the world, not to her, that he could someday be someone different. And then she walked away. Heart steady, tears unfallen, soul free. And that was the real ending. Not dramatic, not cruel, not cinematic in the loud way, but deeply human. A mother didn't stop loving her son. She simply stopped sacrificing the innocent to protect him. She didn't become cold. She became fair. Her daughter-in-law lived, healed, laughed, and built a future grounded in strength and dignity. The mother learned that sometimes the bravest love is the one that refuses to surrender to guilt. The son learned, finally, that consequences do not equal hate. They equal truth. Some stories don't conclude with everyone reunited. Some stories end with distance, boundaries, and the quiet hope that maybe life will still teach what love failed to. And as the mother went home, back to warmth, back to safety, back to the life she fought for, she carried no bitterness with her, just peace, because she didn't choose between being a mother and being just. She chose to be both, and that decision, though painful, saved a life. Maybe two.